biochem cell bio major.
Biochem cell bio and sociology.
I'm a biochem bio major.
I'm studying chemistry here at UCSD.
I certainly don't think that it was very just to her or her family to have her cells used in that way. It was also not fair to have other patient cells used for similar testing. So even though morally I can't really agree with what they did before, if families were recompensated for the unfairness that was done to them, there are innumerable amount of cases that could appear just that weren't even known about. So where would be the cutoff? Where would it end? So instead, what I would think of doing in order to compensate for all of what was done would be to have people like Henrietta Lacks taught more in schools and everything, and just have her case be publicized, have it be known everywhere, and have it known that things like that occurred, but they don't anymore, and make sure that patients are very aware of what they're signing.
Although the reward, the material rewards for it was very, very significant, it was still unethical in the sense that that even though it's now saved millions and millions of lives, the world, like pretty much all of the cancer laboratories in the world now have a copy of this family's DNA, a mutated version of this family's DNA, which is kind of, it's like privacy violation to the mass, like to have your DNA duplicated all over the world. It's like, all right, what do I do with my DNA now? So I think that it was materially a successful means to an end, but it wasn't unethical.
That's a difficult question to answer because her cells have saved so many lives, but at the same time, the cells were taken out of her and reproduced without her consent, and that was solely because of her race, maybe even her gender, and that's wrong on many levels. So I would say no, but that's a very difficult question to answer.
The civil rights movement was kind of like for African American civil rights and stuff was just picking up momentum at the time, so it's very likely that the scientists did not give very much thought to consulting an African American family because the hegemony at the time was kind of like, well, they're not quite on the they probably wouldn't mind. They're African Americans. They won't mind because in the social hierarchy, African Americans were pretty low compared to Caucasian Americans. So I would say that kind of integrated social hierarchical structure would have definitely caused them to not give a second thought to consulting the family.
Well, it was definitely a time of racial segregation and white supremacy, and African Americans were not, or any other races aside from Caucasians, were deemed inferior and not of the same standard, so they were not equal, so they didn't have the same rights, or they didn't have rights to begin with in the eyes of white supremacists. So that definitely affected the way that was Henrietta Lacks was treated.
The eugenics movement, and there was there was sterilization.
Essentially because of her class, her race, the fact that she didn't pay for it, she's probably from a lower paying district or things like that. It's just historically, people weren't as concerned about the human factor as they are supposedly today. I still think in science there's a whole dehumanization occurring which as a physician needs to occur, or as a scientist, as a researcher, a dehumanization factor must be present. At the same time, morally, to the families, there needs to be protections in place so that way the dehumanization factor doesn't cause them that sort of grief.
Yeah, stem cells. Like, I can see this happening today in terms of like how a doctor would may select kind of like subconsciously or hopefully not, but consciously select which patients he or she will want to sample for like their stem cells and stuff. And I personally think that that using the stem cells is fine, but that the patient should first give consent to donating the stem cells, because I think it ties back to the privacy thing with the HeLa cells, that when you're giving up your body's own cells for research and stuff, you're essentially giving them consent to duplicate your DNA or to take a look at your DNA, which is pretty private stuff.
No, definitely the patient must know. The patient needs to know that their tissues or samples are going to be used elsewhere. That is something that has to happen. They're signing away pieces of themselves, their DNA, their genetic code. Technology is becoming so fast, you can practically tell their life story from their DNA, or potentially like what their life could be. And because that is such a human factor, it's a very personalized thing, you need to step out of the dehumanization factor and realize that yes, this is a human, this is a person, and they must know that their tissue samples are going to be used in that way. So they absolutely must know what they're signing away, and the potential that, you know, it could go to other research. They don't need to have like a giant list of it could go to this or this or no, just that it may be put to different uses and they may not be compensated for it. So you just need to know. I have no idea if it's still done, because I've done a lot of medical testing before, been in and out places, and I've donated blood, and in there they do let you know that they are going to look through it. They might save samples. They don't say explicitly if they're going to use it for other purposes, but it's sort of implied. I think that implication needs to be, if they're going to use it, they need to say it explicitly, not just imply it. But, of course, it could still be done today. I don't know of any examples. It could have been done to me. I would have no idea, but I would like to know.
When I hear about the story, I think herself is really magic. But when I heard that the scientists didn't get the permission from her, I was astonished.
Well, obviously, I didn't think that it was fair for somebody to infringe on someone's own personal rights and take their cells and conduct research on it, because I feel like that's something that you need to get consent from an individual before doing something like that. So, you know, although it was unfair and unfortunate that she didn't have a say in what the doctors chose to do with her cells, I do think that because of her, fortunately, a lot of lives were helped and a lot of research and a lot of, hopefully, progress was made. So I think that in the end, it benefited our society, but at the same time, it also infringed on her own personal rights. I guess in cases like this where you're dealing with utilizing some sort of information to apply it towards other people and help save lives, the ends does justify the means, but I think that there could have been a better protocol and a better way to deal with the situation, where you could have asked for her consent and given her some sort of credit. So I think that there could have been other ways to go about it. I'm guessing that the whole civil rights movement was still fairly new at the time.
Yeah.
I'm not too sure about this historical thing. But I would assume that because at the time, especially African Americans and people who were colored versus white, they weren't treated as fairly. So maybe that kind of had an influence on the fact that these cells were taken without the individual's consent. And they thought it would be okay because they didn't really treat people equally at the time. Definitely, according to your race, the way that you were treated at hospitals would have been different. Like, say that this had happened with somebody who was Caucasian, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have just taken their cells without their consent, whereas they assumed it would be okay, especially for people who are of lower class, who can't afford to pay for healthcare because they thought it was a means of paying for, providing for the healthcare services. But at the same time, it doesn't really equate that way, especially if the other party doesn't agree. So I think that, to go back to the question, gender definitely did play a role, because like I said, if you were Caucasian, the story would be different.
I know that in China, some scientists and doctors will take their patients' organs or cells to do the research, but they will let them sign an agreement. So I don't know whether it is still. I don't know whether it is the same case as her, but I think the situation gets better and better now.
I don't know if the whole gender or race and those kind of issues arise still today, because our policies have changed quite a lot over time. But to address the other question about if it's fair to take patients' tissue and cells and whatnot for research, I think that it is okay, it's justified if it means that you're trying to, for example, find a cure for cancer, find a cure for a disease that's affecting and killing so many people. But I do think that credit should be properly due and owed to whoever helped contribute to finding those discoveries. So for example, in the case with like Henrietta and her never-ending cells, if it had happened today, I think that it's okay to take her cells to conduct research, but if something amazing were discovered through her cells, like, they should owe her some credit and, like, say, oh yeah, thanks to her, this and that.